As Elizabeth and her companions approached the city, a shout went up from among the guards. "The Lady Elizabeth has returned!" This was followed with a great grinding of gears and the motions of tight chains as the city's portcullis rose to admit the arrivals. A lone messenger dashed from the city wall, up many a marble stairway and up narrow streets to the very summit, where stood the royal palace. As Elizabeth strode through the gate, Don riding just behind her on the left, the canine beast-man on her right, and Farrago and Stubbo bringing up the rear, she was greeted with a collective salute from among two waiting rows of guards. The king appeared high above, rushing down to meet his daughter with a giant, welcoming bear hug, shedding tears of joy into her shoulder as he embraced her. "You're home!" he cried out. "Finally home!" Elizabeth nodded eagerly, but could get little else out of him for quite some time. She just patted him on the back and kissed him on the cheek. At long last the king released Elizabeth, and taking a step back, glanced over her shoulder. "I take it these are your rescuers?" Elizabeth nodded, motioning to each of them in turn.
"Stubbo Stegans of Stag End, the father of thousands, Farrago and Gnorf Fidelensky III.
"The most powerful wizard in the land," Gnorf chimed in.
"The Beast-man of Blackwood."
The little dog gave an eager yip.
"Don't ask,"
Elizabeth answered, noting the king's confused expression. Motioning at last to Don, she added,
"And this is Don Donaldo Fernando Francisco."
"Sir Don,"
he interjected.
"Or just Don. I'm easy."
"What about us?"
a small voice exclaimed, and there came a rush of lacy wings as two tiny figures fluttered down to join the others. Elizabeth smiled warmly at the fairies as they hovered before her.
"And these are Wil and Chrissy."
A mournful tone flashed through her smile as Elizabeth held out her hand so that the fairies could land.
"Little Wil and Chrissy."
"I'm not so little!"
Wil protested. He was cut off, however, with a tap on his shoulder and a giggle from Chrissy.
"Well,"
Wil muttered,
"I'm small, yeah, but I'm not little, okay?"
The king chuckled, his face growing bright, and the life returning to him as he answered, "Well, great or small, I welcome you all. You stood by my dear Elizabeth in her time of need, and that is enough for me." Thus was the odd company welcomed into the royal palace, even the great spider, monstrous though he appeared. Wounds were tended to, from Elizabeth's burned hands to Don's injuries from his clash with the Beast-man. Chambers were prepared for the companions to rest and recover, whether it was an old bedroom for Elizabeth, a dry, dark place for the father of thousands, or specialized guest rooms for Stubbo and Gnorf. The Beast-man was free to explore, claws clicking against the stone floor as he wandered the many halls. He lingered near Elizabeth's room, of course. She was his anchor and his safe zone. The fairies rode on the magic hound's back, while Elizabeth changed into a more respectable outfit. Inside her chamber, she marveled at the uniformity of her wardrobe. Every dress was the same, a wispy scarlet gown, much like the one she had been wearing when she first set out from the Obsidian Tower. Yet for some reason, that was okay. Elizabeth couldn't imagine wearing anything else. Stubbo lingered in the great hall, where King Peter kept his throne. The little man's beady little eyes explored every inch of the chamber, his itchy fingers feeling their way about for any treasures waiting to be burgled. He didn't get far, though. A handful of guards arrived to set up a banquet table and chairs, cutting off Stubbo's illicit treasure hunt. King Peter was the first to arrive for the celebration, accompanied by Gnorf and Farrago. The trio was in the midst of making some sort of arrangements as the king took his seat at the head of the table. "It was my understanding you were the finest chef in the land." Gnorf rubbed his chest, staring off into space with a look of feigned humility. "Finest wizard, actually, though I have been known to dabble."
"Not so fine," Farrago muttered to the king. "Most powerful, yeah, but not exactly skilled. He does cook a mean dinner, though."
"Then you'll be up to the task?" "Of course," Gnorf answered with a bow. For a wizard of my talents, a feast is a rather small feat. Stubbo's ears immediately perked up at the mention of the word feast. Uh-oh! The little man grinned as he took a seat at the table and pulled out a bag of popcorn as he awaited the inevitable fireworks. The next to arrive was Elizabeth, accompanied by an entourage of a shape-shifting cocker spaniel ridden by 2 fairies. She took a seat at the king's left hand, while the canine beastman rested at her feet. The fairies sat at the table's edge, in front of her. Fortunately for her own comfort, Elizabeth had not heard the mention of a feast. The last to arrive was Don, accompanied by the Father of Thousands. Despite still recovering from his injuries, he was able to walk comfortably with a cane. Elizabeth sighed in contented awe as she laid eyes on Don, for he had cleaned up rather nicely, his travel-worn tunic now replaced with one of the king's old suits, and the stubble of many days in the wilderness cleanly shaven away. Then, of course, there was his wry smile, as if he had just thought of some joke a moment earlier. "So, this is the Dawn I've heard so much about," the king mused.
The one and only.
"And you're my daughter." Elizabeth paused, and then nodded. King Peter smirked, and then gave a short chuckle. The thought appeared to agree with him. Curious. Peter watched patiently as the remainder of his guests gathered. Farrago took a seat at the foot of the table. Gnorf perched on his shoulder, while the Father of Thousands plopped somewhat awkwardly onto a stool beside Stubbo. Along the other side of the table, several officers of the Royal Guard sat down. At long last, Peter stood up to give a speech. "You may have noticed my kingdom has grown rather sparse of late." There was something different in his voice. He sounded more confident and less hesitant than in real life. Elizabeth could only guess the crown may have had something to do with that. "While my daughter, the Lady Elizabeth, was held captive, the vile warlock Thraxis also held the entire kingdom hostage. It was a dark time." The officers nodded in agreement, several low voices mumbling their assent. Peter went on. "I cannot blame my subjects for fleeing to safer lands. I would have done no different in their place. But now, thanks to the brave souls gathered here," at this he motioned to Don and to the odd crew gathered to the left side of the table, "my daughter has been returned to us, and Thraxis' hold over the kingdom has been broken." There was some half-hearted applause from the right side of the table. "I must also thank those courageous, loyal hearts who have stood by me, even in these darkest hours." The applause that answered Peter next was considerably more enthusiastic. Peter next motioned to Gnorf. The parrot wizard hopped down from Farrago's shoulder, took a bow, and broke into an old sacred chant, passed down from wizard father to wizard son over the generations. "Hippity-bippity-boppity-boo, these people look hungry, well I am too. There's little to eat at the moment, it's true, until I work my magic for y'all." There was a brief pause. Some of the officers grumbled as they waited impatiently for something to happen. At last, Farrago tapped Gnorf on the shoulder and whispered,
"Should that be until I work my magic for you?"
All at once it appeared, spread out over the table, a gourmet feast to shame even the one Elizabeth had seen in Thraxis' cursed halls. The officers' eyes grew wide, for it had been many months since any of them had seen the like of it. "Farrago," Gnorf whispered out the side of his mouth, "we shall have to reverse this transformation, and soon. My powers appear to be transferring to you."
"Really?"
Farrago marveled, looking over his hands. Flashing a somewhat nasty grin down at Gnorf, he muttered, "I guess you'd better be nice to me now." Elizabeth, for her part, sat back and folded her hands in her lap. A sly smile crossed her face as she watched and waited, while the others ate their fill. For she knew she could easily clear the table in seconds if she began now. So she ignored her roaring stomach and instead focused on a hunger of a far different sort. Don met Elizabeth's gaze as she looked across the table to him. He held up a buttery hunk of bread.
"Not gonna eat?"
Later.
Elizabeth answered. Her stomach whined in protest.
Just a taste, it seems to plead. A nibble of turkey, a slice of ham, or veggies. I'll take veggies. Anything.
Don grinned back at her.
Now there's the Liz I remember.
Stubbo, meanwhile, shot a curious look Genorf's way.
This stuff is great, but why couldn't y'all cook like this back at your place?
Not enough room, Genorf answered simply. Stubbo and the Father of Thousands glanced at each other. The great spider simply heaved a shrug of his many shoulders, sucked the grease from a boar shank, and tossed the dry meat to the beast-man dog, who promptly turned up his nose at the tough, tasteless scrap. When at last the dining died down, Elizabeth took a small bun, and very politely, very daintily, as becomes a lady of her stature and fine upbringing, shoved the whole dang thing down her gullet. There was a soft burp, as if her stomach were sighing in relief. Don chuckled. Turning towards the foot of the table, he called out to Genorf.
You, wizard, you wouldn't be able to conjure us up a little music, would you?
Given time, perhaps I could weave an appropriate incantation, Genorf answered. For now, however, Farrago has a rather talented voice. He can mimic the sounds of violin, harps, and even bagpipes. All at once, at that. Don was silent for a moment.
Well, could he cut the bagpipes?
Genorf's brow furrowed as he glanced up at his pet. Can you? Farrago's gaze flicked from one expectant face to the next, and his tanned cheeks turned a bright shade of scarlet.
Well, as a parrot, I could, sure. I don't know what I can do with this body, though.
Let's find out.
Don called back.
Give us a tune.
Somewhat demanding cheers and applause made the rounds of the table. After shooting Genorf a threatening glare, as if to say,
I'll get you later,
Farrago rose to his feet, bowed, and opened his mouth. What came out was everything Genorf had promised and more. Harps, violins, flutes, drums, and even a softly wailing electric guitar floated through the hall. Don rose to his feet, leaning on his cane, and extended a hand towards Elizabeth.
May I have this dance, my lady?
He didn't have to ask twice. The celebration extended beyond the king's hall. Even the guards on the wall received a special treat, in the form of barrels of wine rolled up from the ancient dusty cellars. Overflowing cups clashed in toasts to the princess's return. The celebration, however, was premature, for there arose a shadow on the horizon, passing before the golden globe of the setting sun. The guards on the wall mistook it for a black cloud, until an angry buzz filled the air. Locusts? One guard suggested. It was the last thing he ever said or thought. A moment later, he and one other guard fell under the lusting blades of a pair of giant steel wings. The warlock Thraxis lunged over the side of the wall, taking down 2 good men in one fell swoop. Then the swarm arrived, swirling and whirling in a massive storm of steel. The wings of the bladelings penetrated stone, armor, and flesh, leaving a trail of bloodied corpses in their path. Thraxis, however, set his sights on a higher prize, the royal palace itself. Wings spread stiffly to his sides, he leapt into a supernatural wind and soared to the very summit of the city. Every torch in the royal hall was blown out in an evil gale, the hall's great doors rattling clean off their hinges in the malicious gust. Then he appeared, silhouetted against the dying sunlight, wings spread, the sun's rays glinting off their sword-like edges. The music came to an abrupt halt, and Farrago's voice died in his throat before the cold venom of Thraxis' grin. "What's this?" Thraxis leered at the gathered companions. "A party? And you didn't invite me?" He grinned and gave a low chuckle. Then he burst into a fit of laughter. "How dare you!" "Thraxis," Peter whispered. He motioned to the others to retreat to the back of the great hall. Farrago and Genorf eagerly obeyed, as did Stubbo and the Father of Thousands. Elizabeth gestured for the fairies to follow suit. Wil resisted, but the combination of Thraxus' savage gaze and Chrissy's insistent tugging quickly persuaded him. The beast man hopped to his feet, arched his back, and growled fiercely. He appeared to grow slightly. Elizabeth and Don, meanwhile, remained at the king's side. Not one of the officers stirred, either to retreat or to attack, as their loyalty to the king vied with their fear of the warlock.
So, you remember the man you left for dead?
Thraxus' grin cooled into a light smirk.
I'm touched.
Left for dead? Peter's brow furrowed in thought, and then the color drained from his face as a terrified look of recognition came over him.
No, it isn't. Oh, but it is, brother.
A malicious light flashed into Thraxus' eyes as he said it. His wings folded against his shoulders, and he appeared to relax, as if desiring to savor the moment.
Brother? Peter repeated. But of course, there's always an illicit brother vying for the throne in all the stories.
Bits of steel flashed through the tears in the warlock's face as it twisted into a savage grin.
Stories, brother. Is that what you think this is? A nightmare you can simply awaken from?
Peter gulped.
Very well then, Romulus. I'll play along.
Romulus? Peter quietly repeated.
I was born in your dungeon, Thraxus added. Born to a condemned woman.
Thraxus leered past the king to Elizabeth.
Likewise, my children will be born to a condemned woman. But rather than a dungeon, I think I'll raise them in your palace.
That was the last straw. A single officer leapt from his seat, drawing his sword, and rushed for Thraxus.
No! Peter shouted. Wait!
But it was too late. A single gesture from the warlock summoned a cloud of bladelings, which swarmed the hapless guard captain, ripping and tearing through his armor as if it were paper. The man was dead before he hit the ground. Thraxus grinned as the blades extended from his shoulders once more, twisting and flexing not into wings, but a pair of metal hands with long, slender swords for fingers.
Next.
His answer came in the form of a bestial roar. The dog at Elizabeth's feet charged out from under the table, rising onto his hind legs, a giant stone axe appearing in one hand and a jagged saw-like shield in the other. Bladelings swarmed in at the oncoming beast man and bounced harmlessly off his shield. In moments, the beast man was upon Thraxus, plowing through the warlock and driving him into the nearest wall. Roaring with fury, the beast man pounded his shield against the warlock, cracking bones under the sheer force of the relentless blows.
"Quick!" the king shouted. "Everyone, to the throne!"
The first to make it, the king answered the question on everyone's minds when he pulled down a torch bracket. The throne rotated 90 degrees, and with it the wall it leaned against, revealing a hidden chamber beyond. In an instant, Stubbo and the Father of Thousands rushed inside, followed shortly by Farrago and Ganorf. Elizabeth, however, hesitated as she looked back to the beast man's fierce struggle. The officers, loyal to the last, remained with her. A giant scissor-like hand had driven its steel fingers through the beast man's bearskin and heaved him off the ground. Suspended in the air above the warlock, the beast man was swarmed by a swirling cloud of bladelings. Wounds were torn open, only to seal themselves as the tiny shards whirled about him. With an angry howl and a great heave of his axe, the beast man shattered the metal arm and plunged to the floor with a mighty crash. Sparkling steel dust rained down about him as the arm faded back into the stuff it had been formed from. Thraxus gave a maddened shriek of pain, clutching with both hands at his forehead, as the extension of the Lord of Blades' will was destroyed. It hurt him as if the warlock had lost one of his own arms. As if on cue, the cloud of bladelings surged down against the beast man once more, pinning him in place as he took shelter behind his immense shield. In the brief lull in the assault against him, Thraxus turned his savage gaze to the fleeing nobles. No match for the beast man on his own, the warlock instead turned his attention to easier, and in his mind, more important prey. "There's nothing we can do now," the king shouted to Elizabeth. "We need time to regroup. Now come." Elizabeth felt an earnest tug on her arm and looked into the eyes of Don.
He'll be okay,
Don insisted.
but we won't be if Thraxus gets a shot at us.
Elizabeth threw a final glance towards the beast man. His wounds had healed, and he was now busy lashing out at the bladelings with both his shield and his axe, as if swatting flies. Countless tiny metal forms lay crushed, warped, and twisted on the floor, some of which spun like tiny fans as they struggled to take flight with their damaged wings. Thraxus' eyes grew wide as Elizabeth and the king began to retreat. With a panicked shriek, he ran for all he was worth, his shadow flashing forward across the floor ahead of him. Long before he could catch up, however, the nobles and their guards disappeared into the secret passage, and the stone of the wall slammed shut. When Thraxus lashed out with his remaining wing, the blades skidded harmlessly off of cold stone. "Bladelings!" the warlock barked. Several broke away from the battle with the beastman and flew over to stand at attention.
There must be an exit,
Thraxus reasoned.
Find it.
Beyond the wall, Elizabeth shuddered at the nearness and fury of the warlock's voice. Turning around to face her friends, she raised her own voice in a far less angry inquiry.
Where do we go from here?
Don shrugged.
Well, I'm in no condition to fight, and even if I were, I'm not sure I'd be a match for Mr. Sunshine out there. I vote Liz and I stay here and cuddle and wait till the dream ends.
And leave Monster alone to suffer?
Elizabeth shook her head.
And leave
Okay.
Monster alone to suffer?
Elizabeth shook her head.
I couldn't do that.
Don glanced around at each of the others in turn.
Well, if anyone has a better idea, I'm all ears.
Thraxus is after me, Peter spoke up. If I give myself up, he'll stop searching for the rest of you. The king was answered with a very uniform expression from each of his companions, and a disapproving look it was. Of course, Bess would never allow that. Of course, Stubbo agreed. The Father of Thousands affirmed. Glancing to Genorf, Stubbo remarked, "Say, Mr. Wizard, y'all got some kind of crystal ball or something we can use to keep tabs on Thraxus? Because it seems to me we can't really plan anything unless we know what he's up to." "I can conjure an orb of seeing," Genorf answered, "but I would recommend using it sparingly. While we may see him, Thraxus will also see us. While I believe he poses a limited threat of violence, he could take advantage of the situation to... how do I put this?" "Screw with our heads," Farrago interjected. "And we don't want that. If we're gonna outthink this jerk, we need to stay calm and level." Next came a flurry of excited jabbering from a dark corner. All eyes turned to the Father of Thousands, who had crawled up the side of a wall.
Common level.
Don repeated to the spider with a wry grin.
Remember that?
The Father of Thousands scoffed and gave up with a shrug. Then, from the cover of Elizabeth's hair, there came another voice. "I know what to do." Wil popped up, fluttering over Elizabeth's head, while Chrissy fluttered after him, tugging insistently on the fairy's arm and uttering many a vehement protest. "No," she said. "No, I don't wanna. The warlock's scary and mean, and he'll hurt her." "Remember the Black Gate?" Wil blurted out. "At the warlock's tower." Don and Elizabeth nodded. "You had this crazy, complicated plan to get past it," Wil added. "But then Chrissy and me came up with something easier, and we never used it." Don and Elizabeth locked eyes. Don was the first to speak.
No, you are not facing that maniac alone.
I won't be alone.
Elizabeth insisted.
The Beast Man is also out there, and once I've rescued him, he will be a powerful ally.
"Hey," Stubbo piped up. "Y'all wanna start making some sense?"
Regular armor is no match for Thraxus bladelings,
Elizabeth explained.
but with the fairy's help, and Gnorf's, of course, I think I can work up a good alternative.
Wizzy's not much for making magic armor, Farrago interjected. Don rolled his eyes towards the ceilings and chuckled.
But he can make a good feast.
Only if she doesn't mind eating off the floor, Farrago muttered. Gnorf nodded. It's true. I need a table.
I don't.
Elizabeth was about to say.
I'm a mouse. I've eaten off floors, off the ground, and even worse.
Fortunately, she didn't have to explain the odd specifics to Gnorf and the guards, for one of the officers spoke up first. We can help with that, the officer snapped his fingers. Formation Omega, men! As one body, he and his fellows bent over, on hands and knees, and crouched tightly together, side by side in a row, creating a human table.
Really?
Elizabeth insisted.
This isn't necessary.
Oh, yes it is.
Don chuckled.
A woman of your position shouldn't have to degrade herself by eating like an animal. Besides, I've got to see this.
Oh! Will exclaimed. And for a weapon, I can make you a sword like I did in the Blackwood.
And one more thing.
Don motioned for Elizabeth to draw closer.
You'll be needing this. We don't want Thraxus snaring you in some dark spell, now do we?
At this, he reached under his collar and drew forth Elizabeth's cross.
I've been meaning to return it for a while now.
The king looked long and hard at his daughter.
Are you sure you want to go through with this?
Elizabeth nodded.
I don't see an alternative. Besides, I'm hungry.
Beyond that little chamber, the castle had gone deathly quiet, save for the sound of angry buzzing. Shreds of battered armor twisted like putty in ghostly hands, shearing apart and molding themselves into new bladelings to replace those the Beastman had hammered to pieces. In the throne room, there still came the sounds of weapons clashing, as bladelings new and old fought to hold the Beastman at bay. Thraxus, however, took no interest in the feral giant. In a full-on, one-on-one fight, the Beastman would have been more than a match for him, so Thraxus left his bladelings to distract the wild man while he explored. The warlock strutted down hallways, dispatching a small personal contingent of bladelings to deface paintings, tapestries, and statues as he passed them. He wandered with an aimless but sure confidence, as if he owned the place, which, to be fair, he nearly did. The king cowered helplessly behind an immovable stone door, a prisoner in his own refuge. That left the rest of the castle to the conquering warlock. Thraxus' swaggering, dance-like gait, however, slowed as he heard motions along a corridor ahead, which ran perpendicular to the terrace he now strode along. A moment later, a little brown cocker spaniel lumbered into the open and planted its paws firmly on the floor in front of him. Thraxus raised a curious eyebrow.
Shouldn't you be groveling in the throne room?
The animal answered him with a growl. The warlock smirked, and drawing his obsidian rod, began tapping it absently in his free palm. You should have brought your shield.
Thraxus!
A voice shouted behind him. The warlock turned around to see Elizabeth standing in his path. He cracked a skeptical smirk. So, the lady of the castle wearied of hiding.
I challenge you, Thraxus!
Elizabeth answered.
Face me.
Thraxus chuckled absently.
Of course, princess. I enjoy facing you.
He looked her up and down. Elizabeth's skirt had been ripped up to her knees, and slits torn in its sides even higher to improve her mobility. She held a long sword in both hands, which was now pointed directly at Thraxus. He flashed a grin.
You certainly came prepared.
Thraxus made a discreet gesture in Elizabeth's direction. The bladelings around him, however, fanned out behind the warlock. Thraxus threw an irritated glance their way, and then he noticed something odd by his feet. The sun was at his back, yet his shadow now stretched towards the light and away from Elizabeth. The warlock lifted his gaze back to Elizabeth, and his grin relaxed and straightened into a thin line.
There's something about you. My bladelings don't like it.
Thraxus cracked a smirk and chuckled.
Is that confidence I smell? Amusing.
Thraxus took a step backward, only to feel the broad, jagged surface of the beastman's shield shove him forward a step.
This ends now.
Elizabeth announced.
You and me, here and now.
Does it now? The warlock breathed. Thraxus shook his head. Really, my lady, I have no quarrel with you. I'm actually growing rather fond of you. There's no need for this nonsense. My fight is with the king.
Peter is my friend.
Elizabeth insisted.
I won't let you touch him.
Thraxus answered with a hearty laugh. Peter? Friend? I thought the king was your father. Fascinating. Thraxus closed his eyes for a moment in thought. But of course, I see it now. The Scarlet Lady. In an instant, the obsidian rod reshaped itself into a graceful black scimitar. The warlock's eyes snapped open, the metallic blades retreating beneath the tears in his skin, and his single remaining wing shrinking into his shoulder. Ruddy black fluid oozed from the wounds in jagged trickles as he grinned. Behind Thraxus, the swarm of bladelings simply dissolved into a cloud of dust. Very well, my lady. Let's see what you can do. With a laugh, the warlock lunged, lashing out in a broad stroke. The scimitar's blade splintered apart on impact with Elizabeth's side. Thraxus stepped back and took a dispirited look down at the stump of a weapon in his hands. Well, that's a new one. And just like that, he found the tip of a sword at his throat. Thraxus held up his hands in surrender. I'm no fool, my lady. I know when I'm beaten. Elizabeth stared long and hard at the defeated warlock. There was something deeply unsettling in the way he smiled at her. She pressed her sword harder against Thraxus' throat, drawing a sickening gag from him in response.
What are you up to?
Nothing at all, my lady. You've managed to outthink me, and there's nothing left I can do. Elizabeth wasn't convinced.
Really? You realize I hold your life in my hands, don't you?
There was a long silence. Then Thraxus began to chuckle, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Do you really? Elizabeth couldn't help gulping. Her hands began to shake.
Why wouldn't I?
Thraxus' grin grew even wider. Well now, you'll just have to find out next time, won't you? With that, Thraxus pounced on Elizabeth, gleefully impaling himself on her sword. With the last of his breath, he whispered in her ear, This is only the beginning. Then the sword slipped from Elizabeth's trembling hands, and the slain warlock tumbled to the ground. She could feel herself starting to cry. Elizabeth felt a giant hand on her shoulder and looked up into the face of the beast-man. He didn't look so fierce now. He could have just as easily been her father. Thus the beast-man walked her back to the throne room, where not one bladeling remained. The hidden door opened, and all the people Elizabeth had met on her adventure emerged to greet her. Yet she walked straight to one, and one only. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around Don and held him close, and didn't let go for a very long time. They were wed that very night, the princess and her brave rescuer. Little Chrissy fluttered down the church aisle before the bride, carrying a bouquet of white flowers. Peter led Elizabeth by the arm to where the groom, Don, waited, the other men standing alongside him. Even the beast-man wore a fine suit, though his hair and beard remained wild and unkempt, and he insisted on wearing his signature bearskin under it all. The bride made a point of offering a grateful kiss to each of the men that had seen her through her hardships, from Stubbo to Wil to Gnorf to Farrago to the Beast-Man, even that great spider, the father of thousands, and finally to her brave knight, who had journeyed through many a perilous league even before their meeting. Vows were taken, rings were exchanged, and the king passed his crown on to a courageous new generation, secure in his faith that the kingdom was in good hands. No one saw the king again after that night. He rode off under the silver light of the moon and stars, his trials over at long last, to find his rest. Ganorf and Farrago returned to their lands, remaking the Blackwood in their image as the wizard continued plotting his conquest of all things. Yet however far he progressed, he never forgot the brave lady who had so appreciated his cooking. The Beast Man ventured into the Obsidian Tower, slaying every abomination that dwelled within, until he at last came upon the idol to the Lord of Blades. He then proceeded to hammer the unholy statue to pieces. Some say he returned to the royal palace, and served faithfully as a bodyguard to his beloved queen and her children until the end of his days. Others say he still stands watch over the Black Tower, seeing to it that no evil should ever dwell there again. Stubbo never did find his band of dwarves, and he was eternally grateful for this. Instead, he lingered about the castle, looting whatever little treasures Thraxus had not destroyed. Yet when he was caught, Elizabeth insisted on the little man's release. The two remained good friends for many years after that, until Stubbo at last returned to his little home at Stag End. The father of thousands was bitten by a radioactive college student, and mutated into a costumed, web-slinging vigilante known as Captain Copyright Infringement. As for Elizabeth and her brave knight, Don, there is an old saying, uneasy rests the head that wears the crown. The demands of rule aged Don prematurely, only for Elizabeth's love to rejuvenate him each night.
But that's another story,
Elizabeth softly murmured. Her eyes snapped open. She sat up with a start, glancing about at her surroundings. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, or even who she was. Then Elizabeth remembered. The golden fibers surrounding were straw, and she was in a barn, and it was cold. So very cold. Elizabeth pulled her cloak tight about her shoulders. Yes, her tattered little red cloak. She peered out of her shelter. The world was a fair deal larger than she recalled. But of course she was a mouse! And there was the scale, just large enough to strap onto a child's foot for a great ape, but large enough to serve as the base of a vehicle of sorts for a mouse. And there was Monster, sitting up and shaking his head as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. There was a low groan somewhere to the left. Elizabeth crept out of her shelter and saw that the wind had died down, and the shutters had stopped flapping. Elizabeth ignored Stu, who just then sat up on a pile of hay just a bit to the right of the opening, and crept towards the window, if that was what it was. The sky had clouded over, and the stars gone dark. Elizabeth thought back to the prior evening and Stu's ramblings about...
Stu?
Elizabeth spoke up. The shrew sat still and gazed back at Elizabeth. Hey!
Did you wish upon the star?
Stu blinked and rubbed his forehead in thought.
I started to, and the next thing I knew, I was having the craziest dream. I was a great ape, see, but I was still real short. Just my luck, a giant, and I'm a short giant.
Then his eyes grew wide as he thought back.
And y'all was there, and
he glanced towards the scale and pointed to Monster.
And y'all was there, and y'all.
He motioned to the drowsy but slowly awakening forms of Peter and Matrix, where they reclined beside the dying embers of Peter's fire pit. Elizabeth smiled ruefully.
I also dreamed I was a great ape, and I saw Don again, and the children.
And there was this crazy wizard.
Elizabeth nodded.
And a real mean fella trying to kill Pete.
Elizabeth nodded. Stu stared at her aghast.
We had the same dream.
He gave a faltering laugh as he thought about it.
And that was Don, eh?
It was.
Stu gazed into Elizabeth's eyes for a time, and then sighed and shook his head.
I see what y'all saw in him.
Elizabeth looked to Monster with a wry smile.
What about you? Did you have any dreams?
Monster scowled back at Elizabeth and grumbled under his breath.
Y'all dreamed y'all was tough and scary till Elizabeth came along and melted y'all, right?
Stu shouted. Monster growled in annoyance, but then he nodded. Matrix squeaked. Elizabeth smiled back at the excited spider and then helped Stu to his feet. As the two sauntered back to the fire pit, Elizabeth's gaze fell upon Peter.
What about you?
she wanted to say.
Any fun dreams?
Yet as Peter looked up at her, Elizabeth's words died in her throat.
What's wrong?
She whispered.
You look like you just lost your best friend in the whole world.
Peter nodded wearily.
In a sense, perhaps I did.
Elizabeth paused, taken aback.
I don't understand.
And I hope you never do,
Peter mumbled. Then he forced a smile and shook his head.
Oh, but enough about that. I say, Bess, you look rather pleased.
Elizabeth blinked. It took her a moment before her words returned to her.
Oh. Yes, I think I am.
I'm very glad to hear it,
Peter answered. He grunted, his smile relaxing into a more natural form.
Merry Christmas, Bess.
Elizabeth nodded.
Yes, it really is.
Oh, Matrix agreed. Monster said nothing, but smirked and nodded.
Heh,
Stu mused.
well, God bless us, everyone.
And so, on the coldest, darkest night of Elizabeth's year, she found an unexpected source of relief in the form of the brightest star in the sky, an old legend of wishes, and a dream both sweet and bitter. Some part of her began to hope again, in a hope she hadn't thought possible. She held that dream of her reunion with Don close in her heart. She went over the things he said many times, and the strange phenomena she had awakened to. And as Elizabeth began to wonder if Don and the children could still be alive, somewhere out there, another dreamer awakened. Far away, across many miles, in the deep black of the night, he sat up, running his fingers through his hair. His mind was muddled, if only for a moment, and then it grew suddenly clear as he recalled his surroundings. At long last, his brow furrowing in confusion, he shouted into the void.
Farrago, I've just had the strangest dream!